I'd like to start by introducing the chair of our initiative, Libby Lloyd, to say a few words. Libby has a strong background working with refugees and was made a member of the Order of Australia in 1992 for her contribution to refugees and the international community in Iraq and Kuwait. She co-founded the White Ribbon Foundation in 2007 and is currently the patron of the Indigo Foundation, as well as chair of the Community Refugee Sponsorship Initiative. Libby, would you like to say a few words to kick things off?
Thank you very much, Lisa. Yes, I'd really like to reiterate Lisa's welcome to you all today to the webinar and about the prospects of the Community Sponsorship Scheme. We greatly appreciate your taking the time to join us and show your interest and support. And I'd also like to welcome and thank our panel. Personally, I've had a long-term interest in community sponsorship and a long-term fan of this method for better reception of refugees into Australia. I speak in strong support, having witnessed the successful implementation of a not dissimilar program that operated in full swing here from late 1979 until the early 90s. From 1979, I worked with UNHCR in Indonesia at the height of the boat people exodus from Vietnam. This was a time of mass movement of people. The South China Sea bubbled with boats, mainly refugees from Vietnam looking for asylum. This tested the political will, capacity and interest of the world, and particularly of Australia. To cope with this mass of arrivals, Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries established camps across many islands and later, with the assistance of Australia, built waiting stations, warehouses on Galang in Indonesia and Bataan in the Philippines. At this time, I was coordinating UNHCR's resettlement counselling and education program in Indonesia. These were chaotic times with rapidly escalating numbers of boat arrivals that gradually came to be managed well, mainly through the strong support of the USA, Canada, and Australia. The Indonesian government and armed forces gave very positive support to these arrangements. I recall the quota for Australia from Indonesia alone was 1,500 refugees to resettle each month after month. The refugee migrant hostels here could not cope with these numbers. Coincidentally, at that same time, from a huge groundswell of community support, which was growing, it was activated within Australia, particularly through the Indo-Chinese Refugee Association, ICRA. This support was harnessed through the formation of the Community Refugee Support Scheme, CRSS. It was an amazing movement to witness. Church groups, friendship groups, schools, book clubs, sporting clubs, and more banded together to support a family. I have friends who are involved then and who continue to be involved with their refugee families, whom they met 40 years ago. Many of them now attend the weddings of the grandchildren of these same families and have continuing friendships. The CRSS was a made-in-heaven strategy to assist in integration, assist with pathways to settlement, assist pathways to employment, address racism, translate and bridge cross-cultural challenges, and more. The scheme ran until the early 1990s. I grieve its demise. The services increasingly became privatised, professionalised services, and were, unlike CRSS, time limited. Australia's always taken its global human rights responsibilities seriously and has played an important role. Hopefully today we can consider more closely how Australia could move back into this space of community-based refugee settlement, utilising a strong community support base. We know the community wants it and is ready for it. We're looking to you and your and others' help to mobilise and activate the support in this support in the foreseeable future. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Libby, for those remarks and sort of trip back to the way things were a few decades ago. To further set the tone for this conversation, we'd like to share a quick video produced by our colleagues at the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative. It will say in pictures more than I could say through words.
Community sponsorship is a groundbreaking approach to helping refugees find safety. This approach brings small groups of local citizens together to welcome newcomers into their communities.
This is another part of just being part of a global community, being aware of other people and ourselves. And the reciprocal relationship is really exciting.
Tens of thousands of people in a growing number of countries have taken part in community sponsorship programs to date. Others are working to launch similar programs. We are seeing amazing results, a positive impact in big cities and small towns.
A family will now be identified for us.
This is giving grassroots, ordinary people the responsibility for the entire journey that a family goes on, from when they land at an airport through to them being completely resettled, integrated, happy.
People live in the area where the refugees are going to live as well, so they're part of that community.
We've discovered there are people in the community who have all sorts of skills to contribute.
Estamos todos para tratar de integrar a gente que no eligió salir de su país, tuvo que salir de su país. No es solo al refugiado, es a la sociedad que la hace crecer, la hace estar más unida.
One of the most important things in settlement is jobs. We actually need immigration from a workforce point of view. So my advice to business is to get involved either through providing mentor groups to help do the settlement or through hiring.
Having things brought down to a community level really personalizes the whole issue. It combines the numbers with the integration capacity, so it not only increases the possibility of more resettlement places, but also looks to the quality of those resettlement places.
Hoy le toca a este grupo desplazarse. Tal vez el día de mañana me tocará a mí, y ojalá llegue el día en que nadie tenga que salir forzadamente de su país. Entonces creo que hemos ganado en sensibilidad y en humanidad.
The experience that we've had in Canada is that community-sponsored refugees tend to do really well, integrate very quickly into their host community. But the other thing is that the host communities are transformed by these refugees.
I know for my children, it's been a real humbling experience for them as well. They will have grown up knowing that their family have been involved with bringing a family over from a country where life was very dangerous.
They're very willing to be part of the community, to get involved in things, and it has been great to have them as part of the community. I mean, basically, they're going to be our friends for the rest of our lives.
It is personal. To help people be at home here in a place that I absolutely love. So that's my absolute dream, really.
So hopefully that set the tone a little bit and gave you a sense of what we're here to talk about. And I just welcome anyone who has joined into this session. It's hard to monitor all of the faces popping up and the phone numbers dialing in, but welcome everyone and thanks again for joining. It's clearly a very interesting time to be having a conversation about developing a new stream to Australia's humanitarian migration program, with our international borders largely closed to overseas migrants, including refugees. However, as many areas of social and economic across many areas of social and economic policy, it's clear that this is an opportunity for reflection and taking stock of what's working well, what needs improvement, and what new innovations might be beneficial as we work towards a new post-COVID normal. Australia's humanitarian migration program is a celebrated part of our national history. It's enjoyed multi-partisan support for over 70 years, with more than 800,000 refugees resettled in that time. It should resume as soon as it's safe and practicable to do so. While no doubt many Australians are hurting economically, and there are budgetary challenges to be dealt with, as a country that is likely to emerge from COVID as a healthy and by all global standards still wealthy nation, it's timely to think about not only when refugee resettlement should resume, but what also what innovations we should be adopting. And the objectives here should be to ensure the ongoing success of refugee settlement in this country and the maintenance of public support for that program, but also looking at how Australia might be able to do more in responding to the global challenge of forced migration by tapping into the generosity of ordinary Australians. And we have Kate O'Malley from UNHCR who'll be sharing some new updates from UNHCR on those global figures and what's happening in terms of resettlement numbers. And when we're talking about tapping into community generosity, we're talking about those people, those individuals in our community who feel that they do currently have something to give, whether that be time or money or accommodation or even just friendship. In terms of the history of involvement of communities in resettlement in Australia, the analogy of a swinging pendulum is very apt. As Libby talked about before, during the Indo-Chinese crisis in the 70s and 80s, we saw community groups taking a really central role in resettlement. But at that time, sometimes struggling with this role due to lack of professional support for their efforts. We then saw the pendulum start to swing in the other direction in the 90s, with settlement services becoming very professionalised and outsourced by government to settlement services agencies, with communities left without much of a formal role. I now think that policy experts both within and outside government are realising that the optimum settlement outcomes are achieved when you involve not only professionals, but also ordinary people and their community groups in welcoming and supporting newly arrived refugees. And community sponsorship is a way to do that. For the refugees who are sponsored, they can access the support and networks of a local group of sponsors who are trained and supported by professional settlement agencies. For those refugees who don't have community sponsors, who arrive under the traditional government program, they can enjoy the spillover benefits of living in local communities where there are strong links between newcomers and established community groups, links that have formed through the practice of sponsorship. In other words, once people start getting to know one another in their local community, visa categories become irrelevant. I'd like to share with you a couple of visuals just to give you a quick glimpse of how we see this working in Australia. Hopefully you can all see that slide, and again, apologies to people on the phone. But basically the idea of how this would work in Australia is that a local group would form in a community, a group of at least 5 people, though often a lot more than that. The group raises money to cover the first 12 months of a refugee's settlement in Australia. They receive information and training from a professional agency. They make an application to sponsor a refugee. That group is then vetted and matched with a refugee or family through UNHCR, unless they already know someone who they wish to sponsor. They prepare a tailored settlement plan that relates to the particular family or individual that they're matched with. The refugee then undergoes health checks, security clearances, and receives their visa. Travel arrangements are then made, and the local group prepares for their arrival in Australia and welcome them on arrival, subject to any COVID quarantine periods that might need to apply. And then the local group provides practical settlement support to that individual or family for a 12-month period. And it's very adapted to the individual and their needs, very holistic and very organic in many ways. At the end of the 12 months, any formal obligations cease, but what you're often left with is very deep and enduring personal relationships that offer ongoing support and friendship. This concept is captured in a lot more detail in an explainer document that most of you will have received in the post, the good old-fashioned hard copy way. I won't go into that today, but please have a look at it if you're interested in understanding how this will work at a more detailed level. Since 2013, Australia's experimented with a couple of small-scale private sponsorship programs. First, the Community Proposal Pilot, which was introduced under the Gillard and Rudd government, and then the Community Support Program, which was introduced in 2017 under the Turnbull government and still continues. However, due to a number of features of these programs, including their cost and some restrictive criteria, they've not managed to successfully engage members of the broader Australian community in any great number, partly because they were not based on an accurate understanding of what will really motivate ordinary Australians and their community groups to get involved. As a result, these programs have become largely expensive family reunion programs for the refugee diaspora, with sponsors often being recently arrived refugees themselves, facing their own settlement challenges, yet desperate to bring their family members to safety in Australia at any cost. What we need now is to learn from both the advantages and drawbacks of different approaches and develop a new successful Australian approach that will truly engage ordinary Australians. And we're fortunate enough to not only have the 40 years of the Canadian experience to draw upon, but also the lessons of many other emerging programs around the world, including that in the UK, Ireland, New Zealand, and 9 or 10 others. Professor Peter Shergold made a recommendation in his report on refugee settlement last year that an additional community-sponsored visa pathway be introduced, and we were very pleased to see the government's commitment to review Australia's current private sponsorship program this year, a review that we hope to support in any way that we can. The Community Refugee Sponsorship Initiative that I lead was launched in 2018 to play a role in developing a shared vision for the future of community refugee sponsorship in Australia and bring government and community groups together to see this vision realised in practice and at scale. With the generous support of the Sidney Myer Fund and other donors, the initiative and its members and partners have made great progress in developing a shared understanding of what this is all about, in undertaking detailed policy research and work to inform a future Australian program, and in developing close working partnerships with settlement organisations, community groups, UNHCR and other international colleagues, so that when the policy settings are in place, civil society is ready to step into action and get this thing going. The benefits of implementing a well-designed new program are enormous. Firstly, sponsorship can make refugees feel much more welcome and facilitate fantastic economic and social participation outcomes. Consider just the question of employment. As my local greengrocer told me the other day, these days getting a job is all about who you know. It doesn't matter what industry. The Canadian data is testament to the need for refugees to tap into local social and professional networks. There in Canada, the vast majority of sponsored refugees are finding employment within their first full calendar year of arrival, supported by the networks and mentoring given to them by their sponsor groups. Sponsor groups can also help people learn English by providing informal opportunities for practice and supplement formal classes. Secondly, community sponsorship can enable refugee settlement to occur in any community where there is a sponsor group. So it's not just something for big cities. It offers a tried and tested model for settlement in regional locations. Thirdly, sponsorship can enable Australia to resettle more refugees in addition to the core government funded program without adding significantly to the resettlement budget. And finally, it can be great for local communities as it activates and engages people at a local level. And we're getting great signals that Australia is ready for this. We're just sharing a slide with you now, which is a map of Australia on our website, where individuals around the country have expressed an interest in becoming sponsors and indicated what sorts of support they might like to provide to refugees. And as you'll see from the blue and green dots on the map, there really are people all over this country who are ready, willing and able to perform this role. Secondly, at an institutional level, in the last 3 months or so, we've worked with Settlement Services International to launch and build a civil society pledge where community groups, large and small around the country, have signed on to indicate their willingness to get behind supporting a community sponsorship scheme once we have the right policy settings in place. And there's now almost 100 organisations who have signed that pledge. On that note, I'd now like to introduce Carrillo Gantner and ask him to say a few words. Carrillo is a former actor, a cultural leader and a philanthropist, and a member of the Melbourne retailing Myer family and outgoing chair of the Sidney Myer Fund, which has been the principal financial support for our initiative since July 2019. Carrillo, would you like to say a few words with us before we kick off the Q&A?
Thank you, Lisa. Sorry, I just had to unmute. Let me just digress for 1 minute and talk about Sidney Myer, who started the Sidney Myer Fund when he left part of his estate in his will when he died in 1934. Sidney Myer, in today's vocabulary, would be an asylum seeker. He fled Tsarist Russia. It's today where he came from as a little village in Belarus, but it was then Tsarist Russia. He fled there to escape the pogroms on Jewish young men who were taken off to essentially slavery in the Russian military, and many times didn't come back. He managed to cross several borders until he boarded a ship in Antwerp, and he arrived in Port Melbourne without a visa, I hasten to add, in 1899 at the age of 21. He was said to have had sixpence in his pocket, which he bought a beer on the pier, is the story. I can't vouch for it. So refugees and asylum seekers are very much part of our own story, and a feature of these people is, of course, they are highly motivated to succeed, as Sidney Myer was. And of course, he did as a retailer and a philanthropist in the Australian community. His story is pretty well known. What is not known is that he had a brother, Elcon, who made the same escape and trip to Australia about 6 months prior to Sidney's arrival. And he was established here, and he provided for Sidney a shared room in the house where he rented the room in Carlton, in Drummond Street, Carlton. He got him his first job pushing carts in the rag trade in Flinders Lane, in introducing him to services and shopping and English language training too. Now, so Sidney was lucky. He had someone here who paved the way for him. Most refugees don't have that, and as you said, even when they have a diaspora community, those people are usually themselves so focused on survival and their own needs that it's pretty hard for them to offer services and assistance to others. What this program does and why we have put $1 million into getting this off the ground in Australia from the Sidney Myer Fund is that it offers a systematic approach to receiving refugees and helping them with the vast diversity of settlement challenges that they face in terms of language that you mentioned, in terms of government services, in terms of employment, in terms of schooling for their children, all the things that we sort of take for granted, but for a new arrival, without that multiplicity of support, could be overwhelming and certainly hugely challenging. Our CEO, Leonard Very, and one of my fellow trustees went to Canada, talked to some of the major players involved with the program in Canada, came back, and the lesson that we learned, and this was the revelation to me, was that while this program there was fantastic for the refugee families that participated, what was even more powerful and widely spread was the benefit for the communities that received them, in terms of social cohesion, which at the moment when we're on we're all isolated and doing Zoom calls to keep ourselves sort of connected and in the world. The social cohesion, the social capital that this program builds in communities was quite extraordinary. And the economic benefits, particularly in regional areas, the stories of refugee families joining the workforce in those communities, strengthening those local communities in all sorts of ways, and bringing people together in the same neighborhood even who mightn't have known each other before to work on a common good, so that by doing good for others in the community, they are doing enormous good for the community itself. And that was the great revelation for me and some of my fellow trustees. The other thing is, of course, we're also doing good for the government through a program like this. As Lisa said, the coalition has been working really hard to develop links with settlement agencies, with the UNHCR, with community organizations, even developing a list of people who are putting their hands up to say, I would like to be a community sponsor and to get involved with this program. So this is a sort of a win-win-win-win-win program on so many levels, and we are very proud and privileged to be able to support it and help all of those people who are involved in working so hard to make it happen. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carrillo, for those words and for your support. So I'm now going to introduce our panel for the Q&A. So I'm just going to give you a short bio on each of our panelists, many of whom need little introduction, and then we'll get things started. So first of all, Peter Shergold. Peter led a government-commissioned independent inquiry into integration, employment and settlement outcomes for refugees and humanitarian entrants last year. He's currently the Coordinator General for Refugee Settlement in New South Wales and Chancellor of the University of Western Sydney. We have Rev Tim Costello, who is the Chairman of the Community Council of Australia, the Executive Director of Myer Australia, and Senior Fellow for the Centre for Public Christianity. He's well known as a leading spokesperson on social justice issues, including problem gambling and homelessness, and is also currently the co-chair of the Charities Crisis Cabinet. We have Nyadol Nyuon, who may be known to you from her many appearances on Q&A and the Drum and in the media. She was born in an Ethiopian refugee camp to South Sudanese parents and came to Australia as a refugee when she was 19. She is now a lawyer at the law firm Arnold Bloch Liebler and has recently joined the steering committee of our initiative. Next, we have Huy Truong. Huy came to Australia as a refugee from Vietnam as a child. He's a very successful entrepreneur, founder of the Thrive Refugee Initiative, and now part of the Minister for Immigration's Refugee and Migrant Services Advisory Council. And last but not least, we have Kate O'Malley, UNHCR's Senior Protection Officer in their Canberra office. Kate has previously led UNHCR's Global Resettlement Program while based in Geneva. Prior to that, she worked for the Australian government in a number of roles, including for the Department of Immigration and Citizenship. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it off with a question for Peter. And that is just to tell us, Peter, what did you have in mind when you made your recommendation last year about the government introducing a community-sponsored visa pathway?
So what I had in mind was, in part, reimagining what we could do with our special humanitarian program and learning from our own history and from people around the world. You know, this is a great thing to discuss in Refugee Week. And I've just got to say to everyone who's joined us, you know, this, I think, is an idea whose time has come. So I look back on my experience as Coordinator General of Refugee Resettlement in New South Wales. Great title, you notice, it's like being, you know, Fat Controller. And used that experience and then worked with two experts, Karen Benson and Margaret Piper. And one of the things we really wanted to do was introduce a genuine community sponsorship program, not, as you've described, a sort of family reunion by another means. So we had a recommendation on that, but it wasn't the only relevant recommendation, because we also had a recommendation to do far more to see refugees settled in regional and rural parts of Australia. And of course, a community sponsorship program allows you to be able to do that. And the third recommendation is to say to government, for goodness sake, give a positive narrative of the amazing contribution that over 500,000 refugees have made to Australia, you know, since the Second World War. And one of the best ways of giving that positive narrative, of course, is to show the groundswell of community support there is that wants to get involved. So that's why we really, you know, pushed this program. We didn't go into a lot of detail of exactly how it would work. You sketched it, but I don't think we should get too prescriptive at this stage. And there's a reason for that. When I look back in my time as a public servant, whenever there was a gloriously good idea, like this one is, the normal way of doing it is to get a group of the best and brightest public servants together for 5 days in a training room and to write it up and develop it. Now, the end result of that was known technically as the bugger up technique. And it was the bugger up technique because very rarely did it actually meet the needs of the community or the people the program was ended up. So what we've got to do here is to say this is going to be a program that's going to involve skin in the game, not just for government, but for communities, and get them together to co-design this program. Public servants on behalf of government, with community groups, with refugees and their authentic lived experience, and together put the detail together of how this program could work. And now's the time to do it. You know, I can't think of a better time. This is the first time in 75 years that Australia hasn't had large-scale migration. What a great time to stop, breathe, pause, and think, well, what do we want out of our migration program in general? How many permanent, how many temporary, family union skilled? But also pause to think, and how can we make our proud special humanitarian program even more effective? And I think this is the time to do it, and to do it in a co-design way.
Thank you very much, Peter. Wise words indeed. I might turn to Nyadol now and ask, Nyadol, would you like to share any personal perspectives on the value that you think a community refugee sponsorship program could offer to newly arrived refugees?
I think by its very nature, the way it's set up so that a person is brought here by a group of people willing to assist them, really set them up to succeed. And I think that's been bear out by the evidence when we look at the Canadian example. When my family and I came here, we were sponsored by a family member through, I think it was through the family reunion, but under the humanitarian program. And we had to find within 2 weeks, because there's so many of us, there was 10 of us, we had to find our own place. And of course, the lady that brought us here, since she had her own family, couldn't really support us. So within 2 weeks, we were on our own, trying to locate the local shopping center, trying to find schools, trying to register. And in some way, it did impact our transition. And eventually, my family had to move to Ballarat because it was just harder to stay in Melbourne at the time. I had to find out where to go to school on my own. So there was not really a lot of guidance, and it took us a while before we could establish ourselves into the community. And when I think about what would be an ideal way of supporting people who come through this program would almost be, a combination of people from the mainstream community who are established and have roots here, as well as people who just recently arrived, so that the person that is coming in is able to tap into the both experience, is able to be assisted by community members or new migrants who understand the most recent challenges of settling into a new country. But at the same time, because the group that would sponsor would hopefully be diverse, tap into people who have been born and raised here and have much more stronger and established roots, so that it's easier for them to transition into employment and also just generally integrate into the community.
Thank you, Nyadol. Really great observations. You might turn to Kate O'Malley now. There's been some recent facts and figures released by UNHCR, which I thought you might like to share with us in terms of just setting the global context in which this discussion's happening around refugee settlement.
Thanks, Lisa. And indeed, it is Refugee Week in Australia, and tomorrow World Refugee Day, which is, and it's this time of the year that UNHCR puts out updated statistics on the kind of global needs. Next week, we'll see the figures come out for resettlement. But at the moment, with 79.5 million people displaced in the world, which I think they said if it was a country, it'd be the 20th biggest country in the world. With global displacement doubled in the last 10 years, the need for these programs certainly is stronger than ever. I think the success that we had in 2019 with the Global Compact on Refugees coming into its existence, here it is, it's great in terms of its recognition of the fact that in order to respond globally to the level of needs that we have, we really do need to think about all of the actors that can be involved in supporting refugees. There's about 1.4 million refugees who have been identified as in need of resettlement. So it's not all refugees, it's a number where their ongoing existence in their country, asylum is completely unsustainable, women at risk, victims of torture, and other high protection needs. But of that, we expect probably only to resettle around 60 to 70,000. And with obviously the COVID context, we've seen suspension of many of the programs that have around the world, which is obviously quite problematic. And again, we really need to be able to see that growth. These are the sorts of programs, and part of the ask, certainly from UNHCR, the international community, is thinking about innovative ways that we can approach new designs to create greater protection.
Thank you very much, Kate. I think I'm going to go to Tim next, but perhaps before I ask him the question, I'll just, one of the questions that's been asked by one of the participants is about this question of whether sponsorship involves drawing on the government-funded program quota and noting that the Canadian model accepts people on top of the government's humanitarian quota. I'd just like to respond to that by saying it's very much part of the work here that we're doing, that ultimately we work towards a model in which the community-sponsored program builds on the government's traditional humanitarian pathway. So that is an aspect of the model that we're definitely aspiring towards. But Tim, perhaps you can say a word or two about that in your comments, and also just talk a little bit about the role that you think faith communities might have in an Australian program, obviously noting that they've been very heavily involved in overseas programs.
Yeah, thanks. So I think this program is not just an excellent program. I think it badly needs to be given an opportunity of a demonstration model, a pilot, to iron any practical different cultural issues, say to the Canadian model or the British model out. And I say it's an excellent program because for me, it actually is pushing on an open door of what faith communities badly want to do. You will have very different political views in faith communities about how government should aid the needy or refugees. What you won't have in faith communities is any equivocation that they should be helping refugees, whatever their political views are. That is quite fundamental to their faiths, which is why churches in Canada and Britain, including our own Hillsong, which has a chapter or a church in London, have been so enthusiastic and energized by it. And that's not a mystery to me. You know, my long years at World Vision, I never stopped to marvel at just the chemistry that was created by Australians sponsoring a child and having this sense of doing something. Every human wants to look in the mirror and have a good picture to tell about themselves. And that chemistry of sponsoring a child. Interestingly, World Vision just before COVID has flipped it. I'm not with World Vision now, but it came up with a new program called Chosen, where children in the developing world on a Zoom choose a sponsor in Australia, America, Britain. And the magic of that is even greater. It's quite interesting just to observe the power of it. So for all the reasons you've heard, I don't need to elaborate them. This is a brilliant model. It's what civil society and faith-based groups want to do, whatever their political views are about government help or programs, they want to do this. So here I'll end the sermon, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Tim. I'm going to go to Huy Truong now, just to talk a little bit about how he sees the role of business playing a part in a community sponsorship program. Huy, over to you.
Thanks, Lisa. And let me just start by, for those who aren't familiar with Thrive. So Thrive provides financial capital, mentoring, business planning support to refugees and asylum seekers who are interested in starting their own small business or micro enterprise. So we've been operating just almost up to 3 years now, and we've had about 1,300 refugees walk through our doors who are all looking at small business as a platform to rebuild their financial life. Obviously, we're not in a position to help every single one of the 1,300, depending on the nature of their circumstances, where they are, their ideas, their plan, etc. But there's two key things that have really emerged as to what maximizes the probability of one of these refugees doing really well with their small business. One is financial capital. That goes, without saying. It's not cheap to start a business in Australia. And secondly, it is their social and community capital. And when we sit down with a particular applicant and we start going through their business plan and their cash flow planning, and invariably it always goes down to where are your customers, how you're going to develop your marketing to, which community you're going to market to, etc. Those who already have quite a strong network, be it because they've been in Australia for a number of years and well entrenched in a particular community or a particular club or what have you, will do very well because they've already got that first, second, third customer. They have the credibility and they're on their way. And we're just, in a sense, helping them accelerate that growth. For those who walk into our office and can't really point to any local community support, it's much harder to obviously fund that organisation. Even if we wanted to give them the capital, it would actually be a disservice to them because ultimately they would really struggle to get the revenues in. So when I look at this program, and if a family or an individual is being sponsored in by a community, and particularly given most of the refugees that arrive in Australia typically come from an economy where it's dominated by sole traders or small businesses. Carrillo earlier mentioned Sidney, Myer, classic example, just wanted to start a rag trade. If you're sponsoring as part of a community, then immediately you've got a potential customer base. Now, not every member of a community can give everyone a job, but certainly most members of a community can be a customer, no matter how big or small of a micro enterprise. And that's why, so it's not necessarily, so I'm probably not answering your question about the role of business. I'm probably more thinking about the role of enterprise and the role of trade and the role of commerce, that if someone comes in through a sponsored and becomes part of a community, that platform can really be leveraged to do a lot more. And I think increasingly we see that successful financial integration is key to successful integration, full stop, you know, as much as anything else. So hopefully that gives you some insights into how commerce and industry and this type of program can really work hand in hand together.
Great, thank you, Hugh. We might go to Ms. Susan Templeman, who has a question, which I think she's going to share herself.
Yeah, thank you. Look, and thank you so much for doing this in Refugee Week. It's really great for us as MPs to hear it. Now, I just want to ask a practical question. I have a group of Anglican churches have got together in the Blue Mountains. They've brought in, they've sponsored a dad and his daughter who are refugees. What would I say to them about what the practical difference would be from the program they've been using to this model?
Yeah, great question, and it gets a little bit technical. I might try and take this one myself, if that's all right. So I'm actually quite familiar with that case. We have at the moment in the government, what we broadly refer to as the government-funded program, a program which receives refugees through UNHCR referrals, and also a program which is called the Special Humanitarian Program, or SHP, which is usually used for family reunion purposes. Now, 10 or 15 years ago, it was quite common for community groups to propose sponsorship arrangements through that program. But there was policy changes made some time back that prioritised refugees under that program who have family links here. So the scenario of that group in the Blue Mountains is actually a bit of an oddity in the system, in that somehow that group was able to sponsor someone under a program where that doesn't prioritise that kind of community sponsorship model. So what we're talking about, you know, in outcome is probably not dissimilar, but we're talking about a pathway that's specifically designed for community groups who don't necessarily have any pre-existing links with a refugee. And that, in addition to allowing that sponsorship to happen, also puts some formal parameters around it in terms of training, in terms of support, in terms of vetting, so that there's you know, something of a uniform approach in the way that people approach their obligations as a sponsor. I hope that answers.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's great. Look, I will follow up with them now that we're able to a bit more readily to kind of see how you've obviously been keeping tabs, you know, checking in with them, but it'd be really good to talk through with them what the experience has been like and, yeah, what a new model might be.
Fantastic, thank you. There was another question from Andrew Perry. Andrew, do you want to ask your own question? Sorry if I'm putting you on the spot.
No, that's okay. And it goes back to the Canadian model, I guess. I'm just interested, obviously they've got a very developed and long-standing program, and as mentioned before, it sits above the government's own humanitarian program. And I've just looked at a lot of the, I guess, the settlement data on that, like the experiential data, I guess, and that the settlement outcomes are significantly better for people that come through the community-sponsored program. So I'm just sort of wondering, even though I personally think ideally a community program should sit above a government program, I'm just wondering if there is, through some kind of design or otherwise, a way that a community program or sponsorship program could actually assist sort of more general community settlement outcomes for all cohorts that come in through whatever refugee channel it is that they come through.
I might see if Kate would like to respond to this one, and I also have a little anecdote to share. Kate, do you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, I think the settlement outcomes are something that we all look to, and I think increasingly we're seeing some great research. And I would have to say that in the context of the new programs globally, Argentina, UK, Ireland, Spain, Germany, we're really building a great evidence base around the effectiveness of the programs and the kind of where the level of responsibilities sit. I think the outcomes are great, and there's no doubt that anybody who comes through a program will benefit from the social capital that their connection with the general community will bring, and the general wraparound and support that they would get on arrival. I think the point here is, what is the capacity of community to more broadly, also to recognise we have fantastic volunteer programs already in some areas which are inserting some of their skills and strengths. But I think it's the distinct nature of this design is to sort of fully capture the strength of the community to assist with integration.
The other thing, thank you, Kate. The other thing I'd add to that is I do think that there are spillover benefits. I was talking to a woman by the name of Tahira who was settled in Canada recently, well, several years ago. I spoke to her recently. She went to Canada under the government-sponsored program or the government-funded program. But once she found her feet, she started thinking about how she could help her friends who were stranded in Indonesia also get an opportunity to migrate to Canada. And she found very quickly there were community groups around her in her local area willing to help with that sponsorship. But in the process of getting to know them, they became sort of unofficial sponsors for her as well. And I think it's just this idea that when you get people getting their heads around what it means to support refugee newcomers at a local level, people quickly stop worrying about categories, and they just approach one another as people, and they have the networks and the know-how within the group to help a broader range of people than just those who are sponsored. I'm looking at the time. We've got a minute to go, and I don't like keeping people over, so I think we're going to have to leave it there. I would just like to say a few parting words. I'm hoping that many of you are now thinking, well, this all sounds wonderful. What can I do to help? And well, thank you for asking that question. What I'd like to say in response is that for those of you with the ear of policymakers in this area, Immigration Minister, members of Cabinet, it'd be great if you could let them know that you've heard about this idea and that you think it's something to invest in investigating. For those of you who are helping to shape the future policy platforms of your parties, I'd ask you to make sure that community sponsorship is a part of those policy platforms or remains a part of those who have them already. And for those of you who can think of groups in your electorate that care about refugee issues, we'd be delighted if you could put them in touch with us so that they can be involved in a future program that we're cautiously optimistic the time has come for, as Peter put it. And finally, just to ask that you keep in touch and let us know if there's any information that we can provide you with in relation to this concept, or any further briefings that you would like. We'd love to involve as many people and organisations as possible, because at the end of the day, this is a movement and it needs many people in order to achieve the outcomes that we all hope it will achieve. So on that note, I'd just like to thank you very much for taking the time to tune in today. For the parliamentarians among us, I wish you all the best as you steer Australia forward into its next chapter. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe and thank you.